do we share the knowledge or do we keep the knowledge? And
No, I think we share it in this case.
yes, of course.
Yeah.
But at that time, we don't speak that much for the knowledge. But when we say we put the AI open source and we give the software, I guess in the package there is also the data, the knowledge.
Yeah.
In some extent, I don't know the details, but I think it's interesting the switch we are doing in within 1 or 2 years ago to see that there is a sharing of knowledge in humanity. And for example, OpenAI was called OpenAI because it should be open and accessible to everybody, and paradoxically it was not so open. You have to pay and they keep the software closed, secret.
But then the Chinese one
then the Chinese came
in.
and they say we do it, you can replicate. The French Mistral company also do the same. They say you can replicate.
Right.
So it's very interesting in my view that it seems to be a way people are engaged in, and population, they claim for it.
No, very interesting set of observations. And just to kind of comment on one thing you said, I mean, I think my principle as an educator is that it should be available to be shared. So this list would be accessible, not just behind a paywall or anything. However, and this is an interesting point, there are some universities in the States and Britain and elsewhere, I know, I'm sure in other countries, France, some of the research is so sensitive in the sciences and stuff that it is actually not published. Like the Pentagon pays people to do PhD researchers into weapons or AI in military formation. And they make a condition of it. You can have our grant as long as you don't publish the findings. You can tell us the findings. We'll, thank you very much, we'll have them, but they'll be secret. And there's a tendency in academia now to sign non-disclosure agreements, and especially working at the cutting edge of science and technology. Now, I don't agree with that. I'm a humanities guy. I would say that if you're working on stuff that you have to keep secret, you shouldn't be working on it, you know, and you should be swearing a kind of Hippocratic oath for scholars. I want every scientist to sign a Hippocratic oath that they won't misuse their knowledge or create knowledge that can be misused. And I'll give an example. When I was working at the University of London, I discovered that the University of East Anglia had given a PhD to an Iraqi scientist who was researching biological weapons. And how you can make, you know, things that can kill mass populations. She was from Iraq. She was working in Saddam's, you know, scientific elite, and we gave her a PhD to do that. Right now, you see, I don't agree with that kind of research. Full stop. And I mean, I know that some people do that stuff. They say, well, it's only to defend against that stuff, but I think our duty as scholars and academics is to do life-enhancing research, not death-enhancing. So there are some difficult questions, but on the whole, I would say that knowledge, the advancement of knowledge, as we had a couple of weeks ago with the Advancement of Science project, Francis Bacon Mark II, the advancement of learning, we have to trust that human beings are good deep down and will not misuse the knowledge. But anyway, you know, and that's the point of a viva. Your examiners should be able to ferret out if you're planning to take this knowledge and unleash a dirty bomb in Manhattan or something or wherever. You shouldn't be passed. You shouldn't get the exam. And that's about academic, you know, rigor, as they call it. But anyway, any other comments?
Well, there is various ways of doing it. Signing NDAs is very often for financial reasons as well, because you have a product that you you actually have designed and built around in high secrecy, very much of secrecy, and you want to market it and recover some of the costs you've had on developing it, and you don't want somebody else to go away with your
Yeah. Yeah, and there are
finances.
obviously people.
So there's various ways of looking at it as well, I guess. I also signed a lot of NDAs with naval, like the Swedish Navy, Norwegian Navy, French Navy, etc. For
You did. You had to
yeah,
sign.
yeah. And I also had to well, no, you get to know a lot of stuff that could be very sensitive for if it came into the wrong hands. So you have to
keep it.
You have to keep it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against all secrets just by definition, because philosophy itself has its secrets, and if you go back to Pythagoras, say, who founded philosophy in many ways, we think he coined the word even, and founded the first school of philosophy in Crotona in southern Italy. He actually swore his disciples to silence for the first year of their studies with him. They weren't not allowed to discourse about what they learned in the philosophy class, because he was teaching really sensitive stuff. He'd been to Egypt, he'd learned all the Egyptian wisdom. He'd been to Babylonia, he knew all the Babylonian wisdom. He'd been all over Greece, and he was part Phoenician. So he was teaching a sort of synthesis of all possible known knowledge, a mixture of science and spirituality. And he didn't want this getting out in the wrong hands, because people could misuse it. So I think philosophy has its, I mean, I've always taken the view philosophy has its own, or the spirit has its own self-defense mechanisms. You know, if people try and approach knowledge for the wrong reason, in the wrong way and for the wrong motivations, then they won't be able to get it. You know, anyway, it'd be fun to. I'd love to build this project. So if anyone wants to contact me, what I need is like 10 super AI geniuses working in Oxford, Cambridge, Naples, Paris, Oslo, and let's get to work. You know, let's do it. And one in the Vatican would be good as well, and DC. To see what happens. But it's a peace project. Right, okay, let's move on. Let's do our periodic table now. It's that time of night. Do you go first, Jan? Have you thought of one that you want to look at?
I thought of one and then I decided for another one.
Can you pass me the table?
Which is...
No, the table that we're looking at. Not the giant one, the middle one. That's one.
166.
You're going to go with 166.
Yeah.
Which is?
Philosophy, peace theory, and philosophy of law.
Oh, okay, great.
Because that is very actual these days.
Very relevant, yeah.
Very relevant.
Okay, we'll come to that. Armel, have you got one for us?
Yes. Esoteric Freemasonry, co-masonry.
Okay, 118. Yeah. And what about Julie? What have you got?
I'm
for us?
going to the other side of the table, going for American Indian.
Ah.
Number
wow.
8. Have you done that before recently? Or?
Not that recently.
okay.
I mean, it comes up, you know.
Okay.
Right. Okay, well, those are fascinating. Yes. Let's start with the American Indian one, because it's the oldest. I tend to try and do them in chronological order.
My cousin, the writer, he's been doing a lot of research into American
Okay.
Indian history. He's
Right.
written a book series about.
He's Norwegian, right?
He's Norwegian.
Yeah. No, we must get in touch. Yes, so dates, when did this start? I mean, chronologically. Well, the American Indians have been there for about 60,000 years. The latest evidence shows. There was a time when anthropologists thought they came over in about 12,000 BC, across the Bering Straits, when it was a land bridge during one of the last ice ages. But no, they keep finding archaeological remains in Mexico and places, and now it's gone back to 60,000 years ago. So that's as old as Europe. They've been there, and absolutely fascinating. I mean, anthropologists have studied the practices, the rituals, the ceremonies, very spiritual traditions in the whole of the Americas. I've written a couple of scientific papers on this for an encyclopedia of applied ethics on American Indian religion. And they believe in Great Spirit, but also Mother Earth. So there's a balance between the sort of the invisible world and the physical world. So the American Indian spirituality is very grounded. They were very good at growing plants, and a lot of the plants that everywhere in the world we use, things like tomato and all different kinds of fruits, avocados. They were all pioneered in the Incan world, Peru and places. Tobacco, of course, is a sacred plant for them, and that was pioneered in the Americas, as well as the psychedelic plants they were growing, like, ayahuasca is the most famous now, but it's also different kinds of psychedelic mushrooms and things, peyote, and they knew all about this stuff. For thousands of years they were practicing. The archaeologists have found traces of ayahuasca in ancient tombs and things. So this is a very sophisticated culture and tradition. When my father died, I read out a prayer at his funeral from a Canadian Indian about the meaning of life. Already at the age of 17, I'd homed in onto the American Indian culture as being one of great wisdom. It seems to me their core teaching is that all life is sacred. Mother Earth needs protecting. And ceremony and prayer are what we humans are supposed to be doing here. The different initiation lodges for the boys and girls coming up to their full adulthood was very important. It's where they learn basic ethics of caring, sharing, and they're taught, to become a fully adult, conscientious and ethical member of the community. And those traditions have survived. When I went to Oklahoma, I was invited to go and teach some courses there, and I met some amazing people that were from North American Indian background, who'd intermarried. They had grandfathers and grandparents who were both European and North American tribes, and I learned an awful lot about that from going there. And I went to the University of Oklahoma, which has one of the biggest centres for North American Indian studies in the whole continent. I learned about Sequoyah, who was a teacher of the Cherokee people, which is one of the tribes that was forcibly marched from the Carolinas across the Mississippi and resettled in what they thought was boring old land. Nobody wanted it. They called it Indian Territory. And loads of them died on this march, which was done by this chap, President Jackson, who was a kind of Trump of the day, a white racist, didn't like or appreciate native people and their wisdom. He just wanted to clear out because they'd found gold, I think, in the hills, in the Appalachians or something. And tens of thousands died en route. It's a shocking thing called the Trail of Tears. And they ended up in a place called Tahlequah, which is where my academy was that I was teaching, run by my friend, Reverend Dr. Carol Parrish, who was herself part Cherokee. And she ran this esoteric academy linking American Indian wisdom, Cherokee wisdom. She was also Roman Catholic, so with that as well. And she'd studied Alice Bailey and esoteric theosophy, which is one of the other numbers here in the new religious movements and the esoteric stuff. And so, anyway, I was just really impressed by the quality of these. They're keeping alive these ancient wisdom teachings. And I was just blown away by it, really. So Sequoyah counseled the Cherokee people to become literate and to learn, to master an alphabet that he designed. He said, the only way we can fight back against these crazy people who are taking our land is by becoming learned. and he translated the Bible into Cherokee. And he said the trouble with these people is not their sacred scriptures, they're not living up to them. They're not actually reading their Bible properly. Whereas actually we know, because we are in touch with Great Spirit, we know what Christ was teaching, what he meant. We agree with it. What we don't agree with is their interpretation of it, which is like, we can come and slaughter you and steal your land and rape your women and that's fine. No, it's not, because it says in your Bible to live the laws of love. So Sequoyah turned on the tables on these Trumpian white supremacist types, and he, from a native tradition, said we should combine our wisdom with their Christian teachings. So anyway, I was very impressed when I discovered him, and I went to his cabin where he was taught. And then I discovered Dagan Awida, who was a holy man from the Iroquois peoples up in the near the Great Lakes in Canada, probably born in what's now Toronto. And Dagan Awida instituted a law of peace, which is still, it was a way of settling differences in the tribe. And he was like a prophet. He was called the peacemaker. And this is before the Europeans ever turned up, before the Christians turned up. So he got his own revelatory wisdom from those people, which influenced a lot of subsequent developments, including the American Constitution, which is now under threat. Well, it was partly inspired by the American Indian way of dealing with conflict. They called the council, they dealt with it collectively, they got their common sense to bear. So Dagan Awida is another great teacher, and totally neglected. The American Indian wisdom is not taught in departments of religious studies or philosophy around the world. And I think that's wrong. I think it should be placed on a par with other world regions. That's why I'm happy to have done this contribution to the International Encyclopedia of Applied Ethics. I did the article on American Indian, ethical teachings. So that's that one. I think I will. Any questions about that before I move on?
I believe the Vikings in Scandinavia was also before the Columbus into Americas.
Yes.
They called it Vinland, which basically I believe it means flat country, very productive country, and they were the Vikings that we believe they were the traders. They were having a good relationship with the natives, and they apparently were there for quite some time, and
they've done some archaeological digs, haven't they, in Greenland and Finland
and
Newfoundland.
Nova Scotia, Newfoundland,
But I think the settlements died out in the end, didn't they? When I don't know what happened.
I had to go back home.
They had to go home. It was the wife wanted them back.
Wife and kids, no food,
Yeah.
Do you know about or have read anything about differences between? This is all North and Central and South America.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about differences?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a huge field.
Yeah.
And obviously in Mesoamerica, Central America, there were more urban, large-scale urban societies built up with both Incan and Aztec and Toltec cultures, which were more pyramidical in structure. So they had, and they were not always peaceful. There were wars going on. Human sacrifice was part of their ritual, ceremonial stuff going on in the Aztec culture, which I think was a tragic, mistake, obviously. But it's what seems to happen when you bring people into positions of great power and you over-centralise, then that innate violence can come to the fore. But yeah, it's a huge field. You'll have to read my article when it's
Yep, I will.
published. I've got the original version of it still. Okay, let's move on. So that was the primal religions. What was the next one we did?
Should we take yours?
I can't remember. Has he left the?
He's
Oh,
probably
'cause
gone for a tobacco break.
we were doing in chronological order,
Yes.
that's why. Okay, he had the Freemasonry there.
Yes. Well, I'll do that when he comes back. So let's go to your one, which was peace philosophy, wasn't it?
Peace theory and the philosophy of law.
Okay. That's 166, yeah. Yes, well, this is obviously close to my own heart. And it's very much needed at the moment. The reason I got involved in peace studies is because of growing up in the aftermath of World War II. My parents met during the Blitz in World War II. I was taught, the horrors of that conflict. I was brought up to think that we must do everything we can to prevent it ever happening again. World War III is unthinkable. My family were anti-nuclear weapons campaigners, and as a child, this was just common sense. We have to prevent world wars. And so when I graduated, having read history, and largely history is taught as the history of warfare, I realised that there's another story in history, and I met leading scholars who were teaching peace history. I discovered a thing called the International Peace Research Association, IPRA, which was founded by a number of scholars in North America and Europe and elsewhere. And I met them and visited them, because then having graduated, I worked at the University of London to create an institute or centre for peace research. Britain should have one. And I went to Scandinavia, I visited Oslo, I met the scholars that were working on this there. I met a man called Johan Galtung, who was a famous Norwegian peace thinker, a sociologist, a mathematician. I met John Burton, who was a Australian diplomat turned peace researcher, who felt that this is the single most important thing we can study. He ran a centre at the University of London in the 60s on it. And then I pieced together, by travelling. I went to Moscow, I met peace researchers in Russian context who were, at the time when Gorbachev was in power, they were able to talk about peace. That seemed to them ethically their duty as scholars. Kind of post-Marxist, but they want to, you see, Marx himself never really talked about peace. It's one of the great lacunas in the Marxist vocabulary. He was rather scathing about peace, and he was once invited by Victor Hugo to give a talk in Geneva at a World Congress of Peace Thinkers in the 1880s. And he wrote back saying, no, I'm not coming. I don't believe in peace. I believe in the revolution. There'll only be peace after the revolution, when the workers have seized power through force, which kind of ruled him out of the peace community, sadly. And I think it's a mistake that Marx made. These people I met in Russia, in Moscow, were agreeing with me. They were growing out of that Leninist, Stalinist kind of view that you have to smash the enemy and then you can get peace. That's like what kids think. No, we have to sit down and work it out together. So I had amazing conversations in Russia, and they elected me coordinator of Philosophers of Peace. And I'm still, in that, have that responsibility. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, the great philosophers of law in history have been thinking about peace from a legal perspective, because law is what stops mass killing, genocide. It's supposed to. It's what stops criminality. It's what stops violence. That's why we have laws in societies. And so great thinkers like Grotius, who was a Dutchman, began to think about laws of peace. How can civilized societies govern their relationships? So the idea of international law began to develop as the Dutch travelled around the world, they needed, like, what's the rule book? You know, if you're attacked by another ship, are you allowed to fight back? You know, what are the rules here? So he sort of invented the rules of international law at sea. And then a brilliant guy called Pufendorf, who was German, but he ended up teaching in, I think, Stockholm, at the university there. He took those ideas further and developed the idea of a sort of international law as a field, which would govern human relationships of nations. And so gradually then, the idea was that you wouldn't use weapons that would, do too much damage. There were peace events happening. The Tsar got involved. Nicholas II hosted a big conference in 1900 to outlaw certain types of really damaging weapons, like bullets that exploded inside the body. They outlawed that, and they said, no, we've got to have certain limits to violence, and legally. And that led to the Geneva Conventions. So the study of all that is in this box. In the last decade or so, we've had some assaults on these ideas. Because there's always been a school of thought that is more, in international relations theory, it's called the realist school, which says the only thing that matters is power and might, and there are really no laws. If you win the battle, you can write the laws, So you've just got to go in there and win. And so, whereas that was the Nazi approach when they invaded Russia. I think I was saying this to a colleague recently. The head of the Nazi legal apparatus said, we're suspending all law on the Eastern Front. You don't have to obey even the Geneva Conventions. You can kill all the prisoners you want. You can torture whoever you want. You can gas them. You can slaughter them. Which was a shocking thing. I mean, from where I'm coming from, No, law is universal and applicable to all people, all nations. And that's what Kant said. He also belongs in this box because as a philosopher he had written about, eventually he said Europe will reach a more civilized way of dealing with international disputes. It won't fight it out on the battlefield. It'll find ways to mediate and reconcile and conciliate. So it's a huge, it's a fascinating one to choose. And we're still, in the last, as I say, 10 years, we've had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. 2 separate independent states, they'd agreed to be separate. Ukraine chose to separate from the former Soviet Union peacefully. They also agreed to give up their nuclear weapons because Ukraine was a nuclear power, it could have been. And they did it under an agreement solemnly signed by Britain, France, Russia, America, that nobody would ever attack them. That was sworn, in international law. And yet, Russia attacked them, a couple of years, 3 years ago, 2022, February.
First time in 2014, I guess.
Yeah, they'd already started attacking elsewhere, but the big invasion that everyone realised was happening was 3 years ago, and
Tomorrow.
the anniversary is just coming up. Yeah,
Tomorrow.
23rd, wasn't it? So, so that's put the whole international rules-based order, as they call it, under immense stress, and that's why the European Union and other, Britain, my country, and elsewhere, Canada, are, so disturbed about this and trying to get Putin to wake up and realise what he's doing is wrong.
I guess there's a reason Putin says that he didn't attack. Ukraine started it.
Well, that's just absolute total nonsense and
Of course
propaganda.
it is.
And of course, to see an American president parroting the Putin speak is just...
So sad.
But the chap is just not educated. The problem is we've been taken over by barbarians who've seized power with effectively a coup in America, which has always obeyed and observed international law before. So we're into a new ballgame here. And, the Quakers helped found America and the American Constitution. And they were sworn to uphold international law. So it's going to be interesting to watch what happens. and what unfolds in the coming months. So, okay, I'll just say something about the co-masonry, Freemasonry one that Armel wants to know about, because it's an interesting one. I've talked about Freemasonry before. It's a subject I've studied in some detail. When I lived in London, I had access to the Freemasonic Library in Great Queen Street, and I knew John Hamill, the librarian there, and I've done a lot of research, archival research on all the history of Freemasonry, and I discovered that it was really interesting. I knew virtually nothing about it before. It's not taught in schools or universities or anything, but it's quite. It was very much embedded with the British and Scottish traditions, I discovered. And it was a sort of secret society, or they now prefer to say a society with secrets, of an ancient initiatory order going right back. According to Masonic history, James Anderson wrote the foundational text. It goes back to at least the time of the Temple of Solomon. The founding myth is that Solomon hired a Phoenician architect, Hiram Abif, to build his temple in Jerusalem, and who was a Freemason. So the Freemasons are the people that build the sacred structures, temples. And I was just looking today at the church here in Betet. It's a rather splendid structure. And I was thinking, how on earth does that steeple stay up in spite of all the great storms we get from time to time? Somebody really designed that, and it's been there since about the 1250s. So some masons designed that church structure, knowing about loads, weights, bearings, and got the alignments right, and it's still standing. And if you think about the other great churches, the cathedrals like Bourges or Notre Dame, this is amazing structures. And the same in the Islamic world, the great mosques and so on in Istanbul, or in India, the Hindu temples, or in the Mayan world, the great stone structures. So the people who know how to build are good at maths, are good at geometry, are good at, are good at dealing with matter, the material world. But the Masonic tradition is that they also had an ethical component in their teaching. For instance, you can't successfully build a cathedral if half of your crew are lying to the other half. So if you say, are those joists the right size that you're putting up there to take the weight, and the guy lies and says, yes, I measured them all, they're fine, and they're not, well, it's going to fall down, So you need to have in your crew of builders, you have to have people of ethics and morality that don't lie and that observe, the ethical codes. And it's thought that historians of Freemasonry have researched this. In the medieval times already, they were requiring the apprentices to take certain oaths as they advanced through the grades of becoming a master mason. And that's the sort of ethical component of becoming a master mason that then continued. And it was developed in what's called non-operative lodges. The operative lodges are where you actually learn how to build stuff, like an architect. But the non-operative developed, we know, from at least about the mid-1600s in Britain and Scotland. And they were for people that wanted to learn the secrets of the ethics, but didn't need to know all about building techniques. And so we have a chap called Elias Ashmole, who became a non-operative mason, who was a savant and intellectual. He ended up setting up a museum in Oxford called the Ashmolean Museum.